After cooperative federalism, and with the passage of time, and with the problems created because of the Great Depression solved for most Americans, people were working again, people had food, they were able to provide for themselves. The federal government began to just accumulate more and more power, and as a reaction to that, Nixon comes along, and he advocates for what he calls a new federalism. Again, we can go back to the dynamic articulated by Wilson that we discussed at the beginning. So he's articulating for this new federalism, saying, hey, we're out of balance. And what he wanted to do, the way the federal government touches, the way the federal government reach out and touches things is by these grants. So you recall what we talked about with cooperative federalism. We said that the national government and the state governments cooperate in doing things, and the way the federal government does that is they give grants to the states. In giving these grants, federal aid really equals federal control, and this is what Nixon is arguing against. So let's just go over. We'll come back to this, but that's really what's going on. The federal government reaches out and touches the states, but the problem is, as soon as you give the federal government the power to do this, then what you have is federal control. So now we'll go back to where we were just at. See if I can hit it right. No, right here. So so what Nixon proposed doing. So there was all these grants. There was a grant for this, a grant for that, a grant for everything, and it really tied the state's hands about okay, we have to do this because if we want this money, the grant says that we have to do this. For instance, there were actually state grants that gave money to animal shelters, and if you took that money, that's the only way you could use it for animal shelters. Well, when money was really tight, do we really want to be giving money to animal shelters? It's like all these people are sacrificing paying taxes for animal shelters. It's like, really? And so Nixon kind of reacts to this federal control. And so what he wanted to do with these grants is he wanted to combine and reformulate these categorical grants. Here's the category. This is the only thing you can use it for. He wanted to make it more easily used block grants where states could then take this money and use it for things the states thought were important. It's a large nation. It stretches over 2,000 miles from coast to coast. Not every geographic area is the same as the other. The cultures in certain areas are going to be different. So can we really dictate from Washington, D.C. how things ought to be run? But that's what Nixon was arguing the national government was doing with these categorical grants. So he wanted to make them more easily used and more appropriately used by states, and so he wanted to form them into block grants. He also said, or strike that, what critics of new federalism said was nothing more than dual federalism in modern dress. This is coming out of your text, which suggests that your text comes from a more liberal perspective to a degree. So they're being critical. So liberals are critical of dual federalism, and of course critical of conservatives. They're criticizing Nixon's new federalism as reactionary, going back to dual federalism. Now, despite what was going on, a majority of people agreed, and Congress agreed, and they started using block grants. There were still some categorical grants, but they started using block grants more pervasively than they had ever been done. Now, a number of years later, and there's just despite Nixon, there's this tendency to once power is acquired, just for it to increase. And Ronald Reagan comes along in 1980 and says we need a new federalism. This is what he said. He said that the national government was treating elected state and local officials as if they were nothing more than administrative agents for federal authority. This is what he felt had happened with our nation, that we're consolidating more and more power at the national level, and we need to get back to our roots where we have 50 independent states who are able to make decisions themselves. Ronald Reagan had been the governor of California. He understood the mandates that were coming out of Washington, D.C. that tied his hands as governor. And so he promised if he was elected there would be a new federalism to restore the proper constitutional relationship between the federal, state, and local government. So this is the kind of arguments that, if we go back to the beginning of our discussion with Madisonian, with Hamiltonian view of the Constitution versus the Jeffersonian view of the Constitution, that we are still having today, because there are both dynamics in the document itself, where both, and even within the history, where both appear as if they can be right. And so the history and what's going on at the time is where the emphasis gets put. So that was Reagan. Wanted a new federalism to put things back in their proper order. Let me come back to this slide. Let's go here. First. So we've already seen this slide, but I didn't talk about the four components beneath where I said federal aid equals federal control. How does that happen? How does the federal government control the states? One of them is through conditions of aid. So when the federal government gives grants, one of the things that it does in these grants is it establishes conditions of aid. If you want the money, this is what you must do to receive the money. For example, the federal government now gives money to states for education, K-12 education, college education, etc. If you know anything about Utah, that SLCUSD stands for Salt Lake City Unified School District. If you know anything about Utah, you know that Utah is a conservative state. There's a large segment of population which are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and as a whole, they tend to be more socially conservative. And the state, since there are so many members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints there, the state tends to be more conservative. So what happened in Salt Lake City Unified School District a number of years ago was a student at a high school went to the United Student Body and said, hey, I'd like to create a new club. And the club was going to be a gay and lesbian club. And the student made the application, and it was rejected by the USB. So the student appealed to the principal. It was rejected by the principal. After all, this is Salt Lake City Unified School District, conservative area. So the student went to the school board, and the school board rejected the student's plea to have this gay and lesbian club. And so the student's parents sued and argued that this was a violation of their equal rights, and the courts agreed. Now, Salt Lake City Unified School District was given a choice. You can either let the students have their gay and lesbian club, or you can forfeit $500 million federal dollars, because they sued in federal court. $500 million federal dollars that comes to the Salt Lake City Unified School District to help run your education. Now, wow. What do you do? You're Salt Lake City Unified School District. Do you go against your morals, or do you lose $500 million? Now, just think what do you think they did? Well, what you think they did was wrong. There is a third option. There's a third option here that the courts didn't list that is nevertheless on the table. And Salt Lake City Unified School District took that third option. That third option was no clubs. No student clubs. So Salt Lake City Unified School District just canceled all clubs. Therefore, there was no discrimination because nobody had the right to have clubs. So these conditions of aid, you see, they're federal control. It doesn't allow for states to make their own decisions, and this is one of the reasons conservatives are opposed to those type of things. Another way the federal government reaches out and touches the states is through mandates. Mandates say what a state government must do regardless of whether or not they receive compensation or aid, or even the money to do what the national government says it must do. So mandates are a big deal. When I was a kid growing up, all of a sudden, at every corner in my city, workers were tearing up the sidewalks at the corner, and I'm thinking, what is wrong with all these corners in the whole city? Well, nothing was wrong with the corners in the whole city. Nothing physically was wrong with them from the perspective like cracks or whatever. But what Congress had done is they had passed a law, and they said you needed handicap access. And so this is when they literally tore up the corners and put those those slants in there so the person in a wheelchair could get up the curb at the corners, because now they were sloped in such a way to where they could. Before, they were just, it was a gutter there. There was, it was 9 inches up that you couldn't get up in a wheelchair. So this was mandated by the national government that the states had to do. Restraints. Restraints forbid states from taking some action or exercising some power. Again, a form of federal control. And preemption. When the federal government takes over what the state was once doing, what you have is a preemption by federal law of state law. This is all part of how the feds touch how the feds touch the states. Now, these things have this particularly this preemption has really kind of created a type of coercive federalism, where the federal government compels the states in whatever manner it wishes. Again, depending on who's in power, if you have liberals in power, they love that because they tend to want to dictate what happens throughout the nation, irrespective of whether or not a state is liberal or conservative. Conservatives tend to oppose it because it compels a view on their state that they don't necessarily want. So where are we today? This is where we are today, and I realize this is a little harder to see, so if you need to pause it and look, just do that. So here are national powers delegated powers to the national government. Powers denied to the national government right here. These are things the national government cannot do. Shared powers, and state powers or powers reserved to the states. Now, I've kept this here, even though some of these things have changed. Establish and regulate laws for professional licenses and marriages, particularly the marriages here. This is really no longer a state, even though they have state laws that deal with this. This has really become a shared power because the national government has dictated that you cannot legislate marriage to be only between a man and a woman. Establish and maintain schools. Well, yes, state governments do that, but you've just seen how the national government comes in and touches them. So these reserved powers tend to be shrinking, and the reason they're shrinking is because our view of federalism is that we want the federal money, and so with that federal money comes federal strings are attached, which control what happens. Federal government just does not like to give money without saying how or the way it will be used. All right, we will pick up here at the next lecture, and that should be the last for this week.